Let's paint some motherboard parts, because who wants a bland motherboard? Welcome, Simple Rug. This video is going to be somewhat of a walkthrough, somewhat of a tips and tricks on painting your motherboard, because a lot of the times your options are black, or black, or black. But in this case, we have one that's just bare aluminum. So the build it's going into, I want it to be white. Now, with that being said, we're not going to paint the PCB. We're going to paint the heat sinks, and I'll explain that a little bit more once I get this out of the box and I can show you what we're going to be painting. So what I have here is a very basic mini ITX motherboard. And by basic, I mean that the heat sinks aren't all that crazy, because this isn't a board focused on overclocking or extreme gaming or anything like that. It's more of a just basic, I need a computer motherboard. Now, with that being said, if you were doing a budget gaming system and you didn't plan on overclocking, this would still be a great motherboard. But that's not why we're here. Now, what we're here to talk about is painting. So if you've seen one of my builds earlier, the in-wind build, you'll see that I had the very similar board to this. So it's the Z590 board rather than the B550. So it was Intel, this is AMD. That's your main difference. However, that one did have a little more heatsink coverage, to whereas this one's rather basic. But this will be good for a simple explanation of what to do. Now, I also paint the rear IO shield as well. Now, with this, you're going to want to tape off all of these perimeters, because that's what you want to basically seal in there. And then you can paint this inner portion part. Now, this is kind of picky, and I guess for most cases you're really not going to see your IO shield. But if you've got an all white build and you've got something shiny like this, it's going to look out of place. And with the build this is going in, which is literally that same in-wind build, it does look a lot better with the white. Now, you will see a heat shield here, and then you'll see your cover for your M2. Now, for the heat shield, you have 2 screws on the back here. Now, you've also got 3 screws down here for your M2, but I don't need to paint that bottom part. So I'm just going to have to take out these 2 screws and paint this. Now, one thing you want to be weary of when you're painting, especially on heat sinks, is to not go too thick. Now, the whole goal of the heat sink is, of course, to absorb the heat off of the part and kind of put that into its surrounding atmosphere. So with paint, you start to insulate those heat sinks. Now, I'm still going to do it because I don't think it's really going to affect this that crazy. But I'm also not going to go super thick. So the other thing to keep in mind as well is these parts won't get touched. So if you're painting like a case, you want to have good solid primer, good thick paint. You want something that's not going to easily scratch and come off. For the motherboard, however, on those heat sinks, you basically just want that color to be there and to cover pretty much all the other colors, or at least give the theme that you want. So once you get a nice solid coat, then you're pretty much good to go. Now, on the other one, I taped off a lot more than I probably will on this one. And the goal of taping it off was to keep some of the bare aluminum so that when, air flows over it, you're still pulling from the bare aluminum rather than pulling through the insulated paint. So like I said, this one's going to be a lot easier than when you get into some of the crazy overclocking boards. But this one is really as simple as just getting these 2 screws out of the back. Now, another thing you're going to find when you start taking these parts off are the pads that make the contact between your parts and your heatsink. These you want to make sure that you don't get dirty and you don't rub them off. You also want to make sure they're covered and they don't get painted. This right here is probably the most important piece of this part, and that is because that is directly what is pulling and attaching those parts to this heatsink. So what I'm going to do is tape off this bottom square and just apply some white over the top of this to give it a nice white finish and basically bring it in line with the theme. Now, like I said, for the M2, you've got, well, only 2 screws as well. And they're just right there on the front, and they're the same screws you use to remove this part anyways when you're going to insert that M2. So now the nice thing with the M2, since they expect you to pull this off, they've already got a protective sheet on there. So that's a little bit extra that you don't have to worry about when you're painting. In fact, for this part, I probably won't tape anything off. I'll probably just hit it with a nice white on top. Now, one thing to keep in mind too is not mixing up your screws. Some builds may have everything all the same screw where it doesn't matter, but in this case, there are 2 different sets of screws, and it is important not to mix those up. So for taping small parts, you're really just going to want some painter's tape. Now, I have, as you can see, many different thicknesses, and this helps when you're trying to get more creative or you've got smaller areas to tape off. So let me get the tape on these parts where I need it so I can give you a good example of what it looks like. So it's not always pretty, but it should have straight lines for where your paint's contacting and cover anything that you don't want painted. Now, see, I don't have to cover the backside because I'm not painting the backside. Now, the other thing on your I/O shield that you got to worry about is, so for this one, all of your symbols and your labels, they're all imprinted, right? So when I paint it white, you're still going to be able to read them. Now, with parts that have them painted on top or written on top, those, once you paint, they're gone. So make sure you're thinking about that before you just paint it and wonder what each one of these means. Now, that might not mean anything to you knowing what they are, but if you are doing a build for a customer, it might be a different story. They might not instantly know what each of these ports are for. Now, with the main heat shield, you can see I did cover up basically anything you're not going to see, so I can keep the bare aluminum open to the air to, exchange heat. So your main goal is just really painting what you're going to be able to see. And nothing else really matters at that point, because you're not able to see it, then it doesn't matter if it's all white or not, or blue or green or whatever color you're going with. And as I said with this, I didn't really tape it off. I'm just going to paint from the top straight down and cover that up. Now, another thing to note with your tape, you want to make sure the paint is dry before you peel it off. Peeling it off too soon may pull that paint off with it, which then leads you to wait for all of it to dry and either sand it down and then retape it or paint it, or at the very least, you have to touch it up with something. So just make sure you're patient, which is a big part of painting, is taking that time in between coats. Now, the paint I use has a primer and a base coat all in one. Remember, I don't want this too thick, so I will not be putting a clear coat on top of that. And that is why I like the base and primer all in one. It's a little thicker. You got to be careful when you're painting it so it doesn't come out looking overly thick. You should be able to get away with 1, maybe 2 coats to cover everything you want. And then again, you're not really touching those parts to wear that paint down. Now, I'm going to take these, I'm going to paint them, and I will be back to show you the finished product. And there you have it. Now, my last tip, one I'm not able to currently follow because Washington is cold right now, is don't paint in the cold. Now, clearly you can paint in the cold, but it's not ideal. And your paint takes longer to dry. It doesn't stick as well. It kind of runs. It's thicker. It's just not ideal. Now, with that being said, I'm still happy with how this turned out. And really, even with recording, this was all about an hour's worth of work, which really isn't that bad. Now, of course, that being said, the paint's not as dry as it should be before I was handling it, but I managed not to touch it, smear it, anything like that. Tape came off nice, clear lines, and as you can see in my short little B-roll, that it looks good. I'm happy with it. And that is where I'm going to end this video. So don't forget to subscribe. I got more videos coming. Feel free to like and comment down below, and ask questions if you got them. Thank you.